Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is FrancisP. I'm a personal development and recovery coach based outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And today I'm back with another video, and this one is about healthy boundaries in work and life. I'm going to talk about some of my thoughts about boundaries and give examples of different types of boundaries that exist in our personal relationships and our working relationships and just in life in general. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So, healthy boundaries are important because they help prevent us from feeling burnt out, feeling taken advantage of, or resentful of others who wouldn't understand or respect our boundaries. Healthy boundaries help us maintain our self respect, our personal space, the use of our time, our autonomy, and our personal values. Healthy boundaries can be especially important in various professional roles, where a breach of boundaries can result in discipline, loss of employment, and esteem. Healthy boundaries are important in your personal life to help maintain healthy relationships where one person doesn't feel posed upon, taken advantage of, or feel like they're contributing more than their share to the relationship. And a lot of times, what you'll notice throughout these different things, whether it's in work and in relationships, it's like an imbalance. A lot of times, in with boundaries, that one person is essentially maybe taking up too much space or using too much resource or doing something they should not, and the other person is either allowing that or pushing back and not getting a proper response, these different issues that arise. And especially like in professional roles, there are specific boundaries that exist between client and provider relationships and things like that that really cannot be crossed, because otherwise, like I said, it could be a loss of employment, loss of esteem, and that, how you're viewed amongst your peers, that your colleagues and things like that, and these are really important. In our personal life, it's good just to, help maintain these boundaries with other people, so that way, if we're feeling imposed upon or taken advantage of, or feeling like we're doing more than our fair share, it can really sour the relationship. So having these healthy boundaries in place and having both parties, both people, understand where the boundaries exist, can be beneficial for any long-term relationship. So, like, one metaphor I'd like to use is bumpers on the bowling alley. And I use a lot of metaphors, and one is bumpers. So, my boundaries are like the bumpers on a bowling alley, in that there are lines that simply aren't crossed. But within those boundaries, I can work to be as welcoming, flexible, amicable, and compromising as possible. I work hard to meet people where they're at, and I'm happy to help people where I can within reason and boundaries. Work hours are an example of boundaries. Type of relationship sets some boundaries, such as client, friend, boss, spouse, coworker, employee. Some of these have very strict boundaries that are maintained and for very good reasons. And just, to go through some of them, especially like, an employee and a boss relationship, sometimes them lines can get blurred and there can be a blurring of boundaries, and it's usually not very beneficial. Some places can kind of feel like a family until they're not. I think, having these different boundaries in specific relationships, especially, when there's a power imbalance in the relationship, such as with a client and a provider, a boss and an employee. Some of these different things, that having these boundaries in place, help maintain that relationship. Because a lot of times, if boundaries are crossed, suppose you become really friendly with your boss, you say something you shouldn't, now there's an issue. As far as clients and providers, there are specific laws and guidelines that outline that stuff for very good reason. And when I was getting certifications and stuff through the state, like, they show you the certification board's website and the stuff that people can get in trouble for, a lot of times inappropriate relationships with clients, or doing things outside the boundaries that they should. Okay, and that's why these things exist for a reason. Now, with your spouse, you're going to have different boundaries. Now, some people might be more enmeshed than others, but there might be certain things that you either say or do that would be upsetting to the other person. So there's different boundaries, right? Same thing with a friend. There might be certain things that you say or do. Just like you're not going to talk about work hours or just hours in general. You're not going to call your friend at 1 o'clock in the morning trying to talk. Hopefully, people aren't calling you outside of work hours. I've had clients who don't answer for their appointment and then will text or call outside of work hours. Like, this isn't what we do. So we explain boundaries, these types of things, right? And that's a perfect example. Like, work hours are a good boundary, of relationship. So boundaries are important with friends and family. Some families are very close and very involved in each other's lives. They can be phenomenal support systems, but also overstep some boundaries. When lines get crossed, such as unsolicited and unwelcome advice, opinions, or various financial issues, it can create problems in relationships. And I've worked with clients who've had A lot of family members who mean well, who want to tell them what they should do in their life and give them advice. And it's oftentimes upsetting. And a lot of times I have clients who they're not good at setting these boundaries and they kind of feel trapped listening to this person tell them, you know what you should do, yada, yada, yada. And learning how to have these conversations like, look, I appreciate, that you care and I appreciate the advice, but right now it's not a conversation I'm trying to have, or instead right now to be saying it at a different time, but like, I'm not really looking for advice on this situation. And people are going to get upset when you set boundaries. Usually in my experience, when you set a boundary, it's not people like, oh my God, thank you for setting that boundary. Sometimes people are upset, but these boundaries exist for reasons. That way, over time, it doesn't become grating on you until it becomes a worse situation, right? Financial issues, families lending one another money. I mean, it's great to be able to help one another, but you also have to realize, especially for the party that's like loaning money or doing different things, right? That suppose things don't work out, they can potentially, I don't want to sour the relationship for the person. So, like I've worked with family members. I have a wonderful aunt who I'd worked for a little while when I was younger. We have a phenomenal relationship and realized it can't work for her. But I love my aunt, but sometimes having these different boundaries and relationships, they help us maintain these relationships longer, if that makes sense. Like I want my employer to be my employer, my aunt, Sometimes you have family business, these things get confusing, and that's when there are different boundaries. It wasn't a client of mine, but I knew somebody who had a family business and he really wanted to do something else, and the whole rest of the family really wanted him to work in the family business. That's what everybody did. And for you to be the odd one out and say, I'm not going to go work in the family business, this bakery, I'm going to go do this other thing, your other family members might look at you funny, or you might have, be not ostracized, but, they could have negative feelings about it, right? So then you determine your own boundary. Am I going to pursue what it is I want to do, or, continue working in the family business? And these are all examples of boundaries. Like I said, that autonomy, making my own decisions, that's part of having boundaries with other people. Because eventually, if you're living a life that you're not designing and just listening to everybody else, it can be upsetting. So setting boundaries early helps to establish a pattern and set clear expectations. From potty training kids and puppies, to the places we draw and paint in the house, to whether an animal is allowed on the furniture, we learn and set boundaries in the world. And I was thinking this recently because I have nieces and nephew and stuff, and I've been visiting with them and helping them understand different boundaries and stuff like that. And it's really, it's an example of, we learn some boundaries as a kid, like where we go to the bathroom at, and then as an adult it's like different types of relationships. Or suppose as a partner relationship, maybe one of your boundaries is don't come in the bathroom when I'm in the bathroom, or as other people have a door open, right? That's an example of like a silly boundary, but a boundary nonetheless, right? So it's tougher to have unclear boundaries and then suddenly trying to enact them after a different culture has already been established. But at the same time, what we allow is what will continue. So what I mean by that is if you haven't been setting any boundaries, suppose with a kid, they've never been potty trained, not telling them not to draw on the walls, and one day you suddenly say, here's all these new rules. Now you're adapting to all these different things. Or if you've ever had a dog that you allowed in the furniture, or you get new furniture and you're like, okay, you're not allowed on this new couch, the dog's not really going to understand that. Good luck. They're going to keep trying to jump up. You tell them no. We've been through all this different stuff. So if you have, just like my dog is not allowed on beds, other people's beds, fine, but not on my bed. And learning for the animal where you can and cannot go, is super important. But it's hard to change that, overnight. So and also what we allow is what will continue. So if somebody's continually crossing a boundary and you're not saying anything about it, you're not notifying them of here's where the boundary is, right? You're not, because you're avoiding confrontation, whatever it is, you don't want to upset them, then what we allow is what will continue. So usually that'll keep happening. Now I work with a lot of people in recovery, and oftentimes people in recovery don't have the most phenomenal boundaries. So it's up to a lot of times providers and different people to set boundaries, because otherwise, it's just going to continue to cross. So you're like, here's where the boundaries are, right? And over time, people get to learn and understand them, but it can definitely be a process. But if you never try at all to erect any boundaries, people are going to continue trying to push whatever boundary they can, oftentimes. So healthy boundaries at work can be everything from your schedule, your workload. So if your boss suddenly gives you all this new work and you're like, hey, actually I have these other projects that you would assign me, like these are example boundaries, right? Expecting responses after hours would also be like kind of work hours. So if you have a boss that they're texting you or messaging you at 8 o'clock at night and when you're not at work and expecting a response, it might be boundary like, hey, I'm with my family, or I was bathing my kids, getting them ready for school the next day. I'm unable to respond at this time. These are examples of boundaries, and maybe the employer doesn't like that, right? But it's up to you to figure out where are your boundaries in life. Where are my bumpers on the bowling alley? Don't text me after hours. I'm there for you all day. Whenever you need me and I'm at work, here we are. What do you need? But after hours, it's not happening, right? Your personal space. So suppose you have a boss or somebody that's like continuously invading your personal space, or a coworker, to erect that boundary like, hey, you're standing really close, you're in my space. That could be sexual harassment, could be example of, suppose somebody's continuously like they're touching your arm or different things like that. Like, these are boundaries in the workplace. I don't want my boss to come up and put their arm around my back. Okay, maybe some people like that kind of boundary in a work relationship, but I think that it's unhealthy, right? And I think it can lead to problems over time. Doing things that are outside of your role. So suppose all of a sudden you do one job and they're like, hey, actually, can you start doing this other person's job, or something that you're maybe unqualified for, or suddenly you're doing your a supervisor's job or boss's job, or something that, especially if it's outside ethics or safety, responsibility. These are examples of boundaries, right? A lot of times, or other duties as assigned by management could be on your job description, and they could ask you to do all kinds of different stuff. Have everything from work on buildings, move furniture, like what are you doing here? But places will use you however they can and ask you. And if you don't set a boundary and say, hey, I'm not willing to do that, then you eventually will be. So we expect others to respect our boundaries without ever enforcing them or being willing to walk away. We will often find them moving further and further, or non-existent. Suppose that same boss is texting you after hours, asking to do stuff, and you're not saying anything. Like, this is going to continue. What we allow is what will continue, right? Until eventually they're like, hey, I texted you last night at 8 o'clock. You didn't respond. What's going on? Usually you respond by 8:05. I'm not responding at all. Like, this is, this example of boundary. It's going to keep moving further and further until we have some kind of pushback. So boundaries in relationships are complex, especially with a partner. Relationships are a lot of compromise, give and take, with people fulfilling different roles and responsibilities that may interchange. Also, what may be a priority to one person may not be to the other. People may come into a relationship with different clients or different ideas or expectations. Being able to communicate about these things and work through them is important. If you're caring about and respecting each other's feelings, it should come easier. Sorry to brain fart there. I was just literally thinking of, as I'm like reading this, about my different clients who their challenge is boundaries in relationships, and that trying to get their partner to either do the things or care about the things that they do. For example, suppose you have a partner who they're not worried about mess, okay? The cleanliness is just not even on their radar, and you're particularly clean. And I've literally gone through this many clients. I've had clients talk about how loud the TV is when they're trying to sleep, and having this discussion or boundary of what volume the TV is going to be on when we try and go to sleep, because one person wants it on, the other person doesn't. They literally asked me to help solve this issue, but all these different things that come up, right? So cleanliness is a big one. So people are like, I don't get why they don't put their clothes in the hamper. They leave them, on the bathroom floor. Then I'm constantly cleaning up, and they think this is okay. And like, these cause issues over time in relationships. Now, one person can either accept, okay, this person, clearly it's not on the radar, they're not going to do this. I can stop getting so upset about it and just kind of take it on as part of my responsibility, and maybe they can do something else that's really important to them, right? Or we need to have these discussions about, okay, cleanliness is important, needs to be important to everybody because of X, Y, and Z. Don't want ants, mice, yada, yada, yada. Like, we work here as a team. It only works if everybody's doing their part. Maybe we can figure this out. That's a lot of times having these conversations, and I'm not really in this video, I'm not sure what time I'm at already. Let's see, I'm at 15 minutes almost. But like, how to have these conversations. I will make a video like how to have difficult conversations with people, but being able to talk this stuff out and work it out till both parties can come to a agreement of where the boundary is, and that can be a process. And like I said before, sometimes you have to be willing to walk away. In relationships, it's a lot more difficult, especially if it's partner, you have kids with them, all these different things, but it could be boundaries, and having these conversations is necessary and healthy. And instead of avoiding confrontation and just not talking about the boundary, it's a lot more helpful to have these conversations so that both parties can be on board. And maybe it's a whole family discussion, maybe as if you're talking about like lots of this is culture. That's why I said, like, when you've already established a culture, like nobody cleans, all of a sudden one person's like, okay, from now on we're doing this, or everybody's been eating unhealthy, we eat takeout every night, all of a sudden, oh, I decided that we're on this new diet plan. Okay, like, you're trying to change this culture overnight. It's a process, but having these discussions and figure out where the boundaries are, you can eventually get there. So have good, important boundaries, but also don't be overly rigid. Like I said, suddenly you dictate to everybody else, or just decide I have ultimate boundaries everywhere. There's no give and take. So while it's important to have clear ethical or professional boundaries and extremely helpful in relationships, it's also healthy to not become too rigid or too good at saying no. Because eventually you just have boundaries everywhere. And now I'm not doing anything I don't want to do. So as always, I try and have honest conversations with myself. So if something is merely an inconvenience, the boundary can be adjusted on a temporary basis when needed or reassessed. Suppose your boss usually doesn't text you or call you at night and suddenly it's an emergency. Okay, maybe I'm responding. Your partner's not feeling well. Normally they do all these different things. Okay, I'm picking up all the slack because they're not feeling good. Let me, do extra stuff here. So being able to adjust these boundaries, suppose you're like, well, I normally don't go out on a weeknight, but I was invited to this event that I really should go to. This is something I'm thinking of for myself. Like, all right, I'll break my normal habit of not going out on a weeknight. I'll be a little bit more tired the next day. But like having these boundaries, and for me, it's like anything that's just an inconvenience or I don't want to do, it's not really a good enough boundary. Now, there's certain ethical, professional boundaries that are like really hard and fast, but a lot of times if it's just because I don't want to, then maybe I need to readjust my boundary. If you're like, I just get tired of cleaning up after people, so they need to do more. Like, I think some of these can be a little bit more amorphous, where we need to sometimes accept where other people's boundaries are at. And like I said, meet people where they're at, because change doesn't happen overnight. So especially when you're trying to get other people on board, it's a whole process. But I think having these conversations and also coming from a place of expressing how you feel. So you're saying, hey, when you cross my boundary, suppose it's a boss that's in your space too much, like, hey, just let you know, like, I have a thing about personal space. It's nothing personal to you, but it makes me really uncomfortable. Like, I personally don't like being touched, by, like, especially strangers, different people I don't really know very well. I don't like being touched. And some people, when they're having a conversation with you to make a point, will touch you. And like, when it happens, a lot of times my first reaction is to kind of cringe, but eventually if it happens a couple of times, like look at the person or look at my arm while they're doing it, kind of give them a little kind of signal. But to let people know where your boundaries are in personal space. If it continued happening, I'd say, hey, just let you know, I'm not big on being touched. And the whole time we're talking, you keep grabbing me. I used to have a friend who was getting your attention. He'd smack you like, hey. I'm like, hey, you don't need to smack me when to get my attention. You can say, hey, Fran, you can talk to me. You don't need to smack me. And eventually we establish that boundary, right? But a lot of times these are things that are going to happen over time, and I don't feel bad establishing boundaries. Said as long as it's not something because just an inconvenience. With personal space, I think that's more than just being an inconvenience. I think these are a pretty good, hard and fast kind of boundary to have in some areas because it can continue, right? So that's why certain things, like I feel no shame or no problem in saying no to people or letting them know here's where the boundary is, while being flexible. Alrighty. So I said another time I'll have a video about like how to have difficult conversations, because a lot of times we put these things off because they're not fun. But what it does is it helps prevent problems down the line. If I want a relationship to be long and successful and maintained, I need to have boundaries, because otherwise if I don't have boundaries and a person is crossing them, eventually I'm not going to want to be around the person or be a participant in that relationship, right? So it helps actually sustain the relationship and help it by having these boundaries. So last but not least, thank you. If you're interested in private one-on-one coaching, feel free to reach out to me through my email or website. Put the information down below. And as always, have a terrific day. Thank you.